there is a text message that most people would never forget receiving. 3 words, sent at 11 o'clock at night. And the strangest part, the part that says everything about how far a marriage had already traveled, is that when he read it, he felt almost nothing, not relief, not anger, something quieter than both of those things. Something that felt, if he was being honest with himself, like recognition. This is the story of Daniel Ashworth and his wife Priya Ashworth. They had been married for 6 years. On paper, theirs was the kind of marriage people pointed to as evidence that love could be steady, that two people could build something real together. Daniel was a structural engineer, methodical, patient, the kind of man who thought carefully before he spoke. Priya was vibrant, social, full of ideas and energy that could light up any room she walked into. For a long time, those differences worked in their favor. She pulled him toward warmth. He gave her something to anchor to. But somewhere in the middle years of their marriage, those same differences became the distance between them. Not all at once. Never all at once. It happened the way a hairline crack forms in a wall, invisible at first, then undeniable once you finally see it. This is the story of how Daniel saw it, and what he chose to do once he did. Their mornings had a rhythm that felt, from the outside, like contentment. Daniel would wake first. He always did. He'd move quietly through the house, making coffee, checking his phone, sitting for a few minutes in the stillness before the day demanded anything from him. Priya slept later. She worked in marketing. Late nights were part of the job, and so she'd bought herself a silk eye mask and declared mornings her enemy. He used to find that endearing, the way she'd shuffle out eventually, hair everywhere, stealing his coffee without asking. He used to leave an extra cup already poured. Somewhere around the 4th year of their marriage, he stopped pouring the second cup, not out of spite. He simply stopped expecting her to come. That was the thing about their unraveling. It wasn't built from arguments or betrayals or dramatic ruptures. It was built from small things left undone, gestures abandoned so quietly that neither of them noticed the absence until the absence was simply how things were. They still had dinners together. They still watched television on the sofa most evenings, her feet tucked up beneath her, him on the other end with a book he'd half been reading for 3 months. They talked. About work, about news, about whether the kitchen needed repainting. Conversations that served a function without feeding anything deeper, the kind of talking that two people do when they've stopped wondering about each other. It was in this period that a name began appearing more regularly in Priya's stories. Neil. He was a colleague, a creative director at her agency. The way Priya described him at first was casual, the way you'd describe anyone from work. Neil thinks we should change the campaign direction. Neil had this idea in the meeting today. Small mentions, woven naturally into the fabric of everyday conversation. Daniel noticed them the way you notice a new color in a room. Not urgently, just as a piece of information filed somewhere. He wasn't suspicious. Not yet. He was simply observant. That was his nature. He cataloged things without always knowing why. One evening, near the end of that year, they were sitting at dinner. Priya was animated, telling him about a presentation she'd led. She was glowing, actually, the way she used to glow when she'd come home from something that genuinely excited her. Daniel watched her and felt a warmth toward her that he hadn't felt in some time. He reached across the table and touched her hand. She didn't pull away, but she paused, mid-sentence, and something moved across her face. A slight shift, the way a person looks when they've been pulled unexpectedly back into a room they've been quietly leaving. She finished her story. She smiled at him. She asked about his day. He answered. And the evening continued as evenings do. But later, lying in the dark beside her, Daniel stared at the ceiling and held that moment in his mind. That pause. That look. He couldn't name what it was. He only knew it was something, and he did what he always did with things he couldn't yet name. He waited. The waiting, it turned out, was not passive. It was a kind of listening. Daniel had spent his career reading structures, understanding where the load was being carried, where the stress was accumulating, where a surface that looked solid was, in fact, beginning to shift beneath the weight placed upon it. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous cracks were not the ones you could see. They were the ones you could only feel if you paid attention. He began paying attention, not obsessively. He didn't check her phone. He didn't follow her. That wasn't who he was, and beyond that, he sensed, somewhere in the part of him that always knew things slightly before he was ready to accept them, that he didn't need to. The information was already all around him. He just needed to let himself read it honestly. She began going to the gym in the evenings. That was new. She started buying different perfume, lighter, quieter, the kind you choose when you want something to be noticed without being obvious about it. She laughed more at her phone, not big laughs, small ones, private ones, the kind that don't invite you in. When he asked about her days, her answers became surfaces. Smooth, complete, perfectly reasonable, nothing you could push on, nothing that would give way. He recognized that too. The difference between someone who is sharing their day and someone who is describing it. One night they sat together watching something on television. He couldn't remember now what it was, and she said without looking away from the screen, "Do you ever feel like we've become more like roommates?" He let a moment pass. "Sometimes," he said. "I don't mean it badly," she added quickly. "I just wonder if we've stopped trying." He looked at her then. She was still watching the screen. Her expression was careful, he thought, rehearsed, even not in a theatrical way, but in the way a person rehearses something they've been thinking about for a while before they finally say it. "Have you stopped trying?" he asked. She looked at him then, and there it was again, that small shift, that pause before the words. "I'm just tired," she said. "We're both tired." He nodded. He didn't push. He returned to the television, but inside, something settled into place. Not anger, not grief. Something more like the quiet, devastating clarity you feel when you stop hoping for a different answer and allow yourself to hear the one already being given. He thought, lying awake that night, about what he actually wanted from his life. He thought about who he was outside of this marriage. He thought about his finances, his friendships, his sister Ananya, who had been gently asking for 2 years if he was happy. He thought about the lease they shared, the joint account, the small logistical architecture of a life built together. And he began, slowly, privately, and without drama, to make a plan. He didn't plan for the text, not the timing of it, and not the exact words. But when it came, it did not find him unprepared. It was a Tuesday, 11 o'clock at night. He was in the study. He'd started spending more evenings there, reading, thinking, giving them both the space he sensed she was quietly asking for. His phone was on the desk beside his book. It lit up. "Daniel, I've been trying to find the right way to say this for a long time. I found someone who makes me feel like myself again. I think we both know this hasn't been working. I'm sorry." He read it twice. Then he set the phone down. He looked at the far wall of the study. He breathed. He thought of that evening at dinner a year ago, her glowing face, his hand on hers, the pause that moved across her expression. He thought of all the small things that had followed. The perfume, the private laughs, the way she described her days like floors with no doors. He thought about the conversation they could have, the question he could ask. He could walk to the bedroom and stand in the doorway and say her name. He could watch her sit up and watch the guilt move into her posture, and they could have the long and painful conversation that this moment was designed to prompt. He decided not to, not because he didn't feel anything. He did. There was grief in him, real, quiet grief for the version of this marriage he had wanted it to be, for the woman he had genuinely loved, for the mornings before the extra cup of coffee stopped being poured. That grief was real, and he did not pretend otherwise to himself. But he also knew, with a clarity that surprised him with its steadiness, that there was nothing left here to save. Not because of Neil. Neil was not the cause. He was the symptom. The marriage had been leaving for a long time. Both of them had watched it go. Daniel picked up his phone. He typed 2 letters and a period. Good. He sent it. He set the phone down again. He returned to his book. She came to the study doorway 20 minutes later. She was holding her phone. Her expression was— He noticed this. Confused. She had expected something else. Anger, perhaps. Pleading. Some version of him that confirmed she still held a certain power over his emotional landscape. "That's all you have to say?" she asked. He looked up from his book. "What would you like me to say?" Silence. "I thought you'd want to talk." "We can talk," he said, "but I don't think there's much left to decide." She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she walked back down the hallway. He heard the bedroom door close softly. Not slammed, just closed. He read until midnight. Then he went to sleep on the sofa because it was where he wanted to sleep. And it was his sofa too. 6 months is a strange amount of time. Long enough for the sharpness of a thing to soften. Not long enough to stop reaching, occasionally, for routines that no longer exist. Priya was living in an apartment across the city now. She had moved in with Neil almost immediately, and then, within 2 months, moved into her own place. She didn't explain the timeline to Daniel. She didn't need to. He didn't ask. She had begun telling the story of their marriage in a particular way. He heard versions of it secondhand, through mutual friends, through her sister Deepa, who still called him occasionally, and who clearly felt uncomfortable being caught between them. The story Priya told was one of incompatibility, of two people who had grown in different directions, of a woman who had finally had the courage to seek something more. The word she used, Deepa told him once, carefully, was awakening. Daniel had sat with that for a moment. Then he'd nodded and changed the subject. He understood what Priya was doing. It wasn't malicious exactly. It was the story she needed in order to live inside the choices she'd made. He had read enough about human nature, had observed it closely enough through the years, to understand that people rarely tell themselves stories in which they are simply wrong. They tell stories in which their wrongness was justified, necessary, even noble. He didn't hate her for it. There were moments at 3 in the morning when something dark and human moved through him, but they passed. He was busier than he'd expected to be. He'd separated their finances quietly and carefully over the preceding year, not dishonestly, just thoughtfully. His credit, his accounts, his investments, he'd made sure they were his own before any of this became official. He'd found a smaller apartment, clean, spare, with good light in the mornings. He'd started cooking properly again, something he'd stopped doing somewhere in the middle years of the marriage. He took walks in the evenings. His sister Ananya visited in the 4th month and sat at his small kitchen table and said, "You seem lighter." He thought about that word for a long time after she said it. Meanwhile, he had heard, again through peripheral channels, that Priya was finding the new life harder than she'd imagined. Neil was not what the excitement had promised. Or perhaps she was simply discovering that the feeling she'd chased, the aliveness, the being seen, the sense of herself she described as lost in their marriage, was not something another person could give you permanently. That eventually any life with any person becomes ordinary, becomes morning routines, becomes the absence of a second cup of coffee. He thought about calling her when he heard this, not out of desire to reconnect, but out of something like compassion. He had loved this woman. He still, in some residual way, wished her well. But he didn't call. It wasn't his place anymore. She had made her choices. He had made his. And the kindest thing, he thought, was to let them both continue to become whoever they were becoming. The turning point came on a random evening, no particular occasion. He was sitting by his window with a coffee he poured only for himself, watching the streetlights come on one by one as the city moved into night. And he realized quietly, without ceremony, that he had not thought about the marriage that day. Not once. He sat with that for a moment. Then he finished his coffee. She called him on a Sunday in the 8th month. He saw her name on the screen. He sat for a moment. Then he answered. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. There was a pause. He didn't fill it. "I've been thinking about you," she said. "About us. About how everything ended." "Okay," he said. Another pause. He could hear something uncertain in her breathing, a hesitation that was searching for a foothold. I think I made everything so much more complicated than it needed to be, she said. I think I was confused about what I wanted, about what we had. He let a moment pass before he answered. I think we were both confused, he said, for a long time. I miss you, she said, quietly, simply, without drama. He felt something move in him when she said that. He was honest enough with himself to acknowledge it. There was a ghost of the feeling, the original feeling, the one from the early years when she would walk into a room and he would feel simply glad that she existed. That feeling had been real. It still left its outline behind. I believe you, he said. Silence. Is there any part of you that? She began. Priya. He said her name gently, not coldly, not as a door slamming, as a kind of tenderness that contained within it a boundary she would understand if she was honest. I think we wanted different things for a long time. I think maybe we always did, a little, and I think we both deserve to figure that out. She didn't speak for a moment. You're not angry, she said finally. Less a question, more an observation, as though she'd expected anger and its absence was somehow harder to hold. No, he said. Why not? He thought about it. He looked at the window, at the morning light coming through. Because being angry would mean I was still waiting for something, he said. And I'm not waiting anymore. The silence that followed was long enough that he simply held the phone and let it be. I hope you're happy, she said at last, and he could hear, in those 4 words, everything she hadn't said. The regret, the loneliness, the quiet reckoning of someone who had looked for herself in all the wrong directions and was only now beginning to understand the difference between excitement and meaning. I hope you are too, he said, and he meant it. They said goodbye. The call ended. He set the phone on the counter and stood in his kitchen for a moment. The morning was still and bright. Coffee was brewing. There was nowhere he needed to be for another 2 hours. He thought about her, really let himself think about her. The full arc of her, from the woman he'd fallen in love with, to the woman on the phone just now. He thought about how much of their marriage had been 2 people hoping the other one would do the work of closing the distance between them. How love, when it isn't tended to, doesn't break. It simply grows quieter and quieter until one day you realize you haven't heard it in a very long time. He poured his coffee. He sat by the window, and outside the ordinary world was doing what it always does, continuing on, indifferent and beautiful, full of second chances that don't announce themselves, full of small mornings that ask for nothing except your presence. He was present. That he thought was enough.